Justinien Tribillon will be the next speaker to conclude the first session before we go into the panel discussion. Justinien is a researcher, writer, editor, and curator. He has co-founded and is an editor of Migrant Journal, a 6-issue publication looking at migration in all its forms and its impact on space. He's a researcher at Theatrum Mundi and has written for The Guardian or Magnum Photos, among others. He's regularly invited to give talks in London, Mexico, Paris, New York City, also the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture. Justinien is currently a PhD candidate at the Bartlett University, College London, where he is also a tutor in urban studies. His doctoral research is on Paris's boulevard peripheric as a socio-spatial border between the city and the suburbs. So let's continue with Justinien Tribillon talk titled On a Scale 1 to 10. Please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Justinien Tribillon. I'm an urbanist based at the moment between London and Paris, but I've lived in London for the last 9 years now. I wanted to start with that issue of that question or that word even of scale. So that's why I named this presentation on scale of 1 to 10. This is a sentence, I don't know if you have the same in Latvian, but I'm sure you do. This is a sentence being asked by doctors to kind of be able to understand your pain. It's a way to, in a way, produce data, in a way to communicate that pain and to communicate that information in an easy to understand and simple way. And the reason why I wanted to start with this is, well, obviously the issue of scale when it comes to migration is key, and we will talk a lot about scale over these coming days, the regional, the local, the global, and it's also the issue of data and complexity, and especially today, the issue of narrative that I wanted to talk about. If I were to ask you all those questions, you'd probably be a bit lost, and don't worry, I won't in details. I mean, I'm not going to give one of those motivational speech you get in business conferences. This is more rhetoric, and I really wanted to kind of play with this as a way to look at the complexity of a topic, the complexity of the topic of migration. And if you were to answer the questions, it'd be complicated for you to scale that on a scale from 1 to 10. I think it's one of the issues that we have with the issue of migration. And to go back to my example of the scale of 1 to 10, as you produce data on your own pain in order to communicate with a doctor in a non-specialized way, you also have to make an effort of simplification. Sometimes simplification very quickly leads into simplistic approach to a given topic. And when it comes to migration, it's such a rich and such a complex topic that simplifying it too much then kills it and turns into a very complex and blunt issue. The simplification of these issues also, and simplistic approach also probably leads, and it is my opinion, to unease. It leads to anxiety and a difficulty to grasp with the world and space around us and the phenomena that we have to face and deal with as professionals, as citizens. This is to explore that notion of migration and to explore the richness of this concept and very much to challenge the negative discourse that existed back then and still today, that in 2016, a team of 4, including me, we created a project called Migrant Journal, where we looked at migration in all its forms. And really the ambition that we had back then was to create a 6-issue publication in order to reclaim that concept of migration from the negative political discourses that were around back then, in order to reclaim it and take it back and reposition it as an interesting concept that structures our lives, and to test the resilience of that concept. We are a team of 5 people, on and off, on this project: German, Austrian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. We all lived, at least back then, in countries for which we do not hold passports of. We were spread between Norway, the UK, Switzerland, Russia at the time. We are all, most of the team, the largest majority of the team, are based in the UK and Switzerland. We are all proud European Union citizens, yet we do live in the countries which are the least European countries, at least in Western Europe. So therefore we wanted to approach this, all these kind of paradoxes and complementary situations. We were also all, so we were all migrants ourselves, even though we would not have been described with that word of migrant. Instead, people would have called us expats or expatriates, because we are, and we were, and we are, because I'm still resident in the UK, so I'm still a migrant today, but we have lots of degrees. We've made the choice to live in those countries. We do not have to flee or to escape a difficult situation. That's also why we started with that very word of migration, because we wanted to challenge that notion of expats, and we wanted to demonstrate how we are all migrants, and it is all part of our daily lives. Also wanted to reflect on. Sorry, did I click? What was that before? One of the key intellectual cornerstone of this project is a book by a Palestinian-American intellectual called Edward Said, now passed away. And Said published Orientalism in 1978, which I recommend. It's a really interesting book, and it's still very much relevant and contemporary. Orientalism in Said's approach is a concept to talk about the projected images of an imagined space, the West, onto another imagined space, the East. And here, the East I'm talking about is not this East, and I'm sure you are familiar and sensible to the issue of who is East and who is West here in Baltic countries. Here, the East is Northern Africa, it's the Middle East, and it's Asia. And he looked and studied and dissected all the issues of patronization, the inherent notions of power and colonialism that are part of this imagined space, of this imagined notion of Orientalism. The fact that it's imagined doesn't mean it's not relevant, but it means that we need to understand exactly the narratives that are behind it. It's exactly what we wanted to try to do with the concept of migration. Go back to that root and try to understand and analyze that notion of migration, inspired by what Edward Said had done on the Orient. Migrant Journal is a 6-issue publication, a time-limited 6-issue publication, and we looked at migration in all its forms. So not only people, but also ideas, goods, birds, seeds, finance, and data. We really wanted to go back to the root of that concept of migration and try to look at everything and anything. We've had 6 issues. The first one, across country, was published in October 2016. Each issue has a different theme. It's a pluridisciplinary approach, looking at design, architecture, and urban studies, but way, way beyond that, social science and artists and photographers and philosophers and writers. The first issue across country looked at the countryside. It was kind of an intellectual challenge for us to look at the countryside, considering we were all urbanists and architects living and working in cities, and we thought that it was the best way to start with. The second issue that we released 6 months later, it's a biannual publication. Wired Capital looked at data, finance, goods, trading, and technology in relation to migration. Third issue, Flowing Grounds, looked at everything that's not on firm land, so the sea and the sky, fourth issue released in the spring of 2018. Dark Matters looked at darkness in a very conceptual way. It could be the night, it could be illegality, it could be any shady business. The starting point of this was that migrants who wish to escape police control would tend to travel at night, at the covert at night. Issue 5, Micro Odysseys, looked at the very small, again, something quite conceptual, but I'll come back to that and we'll give you an example of this. The very small, the microscopic, the nano phenomena of migration. And our final and sixth issue, Foreign Agents, that we released in June of this year, looked at culture, aesthetics, taste, food, languages. I wanted to go through a few of the pieces we've published because it's the best way. Obviously, it's a publication, so you've got to read it, but I wanted to give you a few of the examples of the projects, the people we've published the work of, because it will give you kind of my understanding of migration, the one I wanted to convey today. This is a piece we published in issue 1, the one on the countryside. It's called Italian Limes. It's by a Milan-based studio called Studio Folder of researchers, artists, and mostly graphic designers, book designers. They looked at the border between Italy and Austria, which is partly based on the glacier and therefore is drifting on a daily basis. This is due to climate change. This is due as well to the normal state of that space. But therefore, they did an it's several years. It's a project which went on for several years. The first step was an installation, which you have there at the Venice Biennale of 2014, Venice Biennale of Architecture, if I'm correct, of 2014, where you could push a button. They had set up GPS, I don't know how you say that, but GPS probes all across the border, and you could press a button and get a live update of the border between Austria and Italy. But of course, it's also a huge topic of contest, right? Because you have to decide where is your border, and where do you sit between Austria and Italy. And we really like that kind of project as a starting point for this publication, because it challenges the notion of political border, which is, again, a convention, an imagined space, in a poetic and humorous way up to a point. Another piece that we published in issue 2, another project by two photographers based in Switzerland, Paolo Woods and Gabriele Galimberti, who looked at tax havens across the world. So they went to shoot all the tax havens in different parts of the world to show where that money, is being hidden. And of course, that was a bit before the Panama Papers. So you might have seen this project after that. And I think that's also a very important and very interesting element of migration. It's tax evasion and how money, how funds, how goods escape given political spheres to go into others. One of the quotes I really like, this is in the Cayman Island, and the owner of that company, the jetpack company says, the jetpack is zero gravity, the Cayman are zero taxes, we are in the right place. This is the kind of story as well that we really love publishing. We've played a lot with maps, we've been really inspired by atlases, and the art direction is done by an offshore studio who are a Zurich-based graphic design studio. This is a map. Again, we like to work with different projections to question how a map is being done. There are a lot of political issues in the way a map is being designed, and we can talk about this more later on. But here you've got a very familiar global north via global south. In dark are the countries where money is taken from, and by a variety of actors, including local, businessmen, local politicians. A variety of actors are taking that money and taking it into tax haven, which are mostly in the global north. Another piece, which again reveals a lot about migration, and this is something that I've researched and I really enjoyed writing, looking at coconut, which is now everywhere. It's now a very familiar product via coconut water. But it's a really fascinating fruit for many, many reasons, and I won't linger on coconut too long, but I could talk about it for hours and hours. Coconut is a fascinating fruit because by looking at the DNA of coconut, you can trace all the different migrations of different human people across space, across time. You can trace trade routes in the 15th century between India, Africa, and Portugal. You can trace commuting or journey between Southeast Asia and what we call today South America. You can trace so much by looking at the DNA of coconut. The coconut is a fascinating fruit because it can live, can travel, it floats, it can survive in salted water for 80, 90 days, 100 days, and then when it reaches land, it germinates again, and it creates a fruit. It can be used for consumption right away. It can be transported on boats, and you can drink. You have lots of nutrients and proteins from that fruit. Therefore, it's really good for travelers. And by looking at the DNA of coconut, you can, for instance, figure out that people from Polynesia, people from Southeastern Asia, traveled to what is now South America, probably in the 11th or 12th century, and settled there. And you can find this out by looking at the DNA of coconut. So it's a very interesting, very fascinating migrating fruit, which is really part of our collective identity, even here as Europeans. Another much more dramatic example that I wanted to show you. This is Ceuta at the border between Africa and at the border between Morocco and Spain on African land, on African soil. This is an example, and this is a research done by Charlotte Malterbart at ETH Zurich, and Georges Bajalia, who's based in the US at Columbia, I believe. And they looked at that really atypical border between Spain and Morocco. So, right, we're looking here at I've got a laser. We are here at, this is Spain, this is Africa, this is Ceuta right here. So, and in this place, if you live within a 50-kilometer radius of that space, you can trade free of tax. You can trade goods if you carry them yourself, if you take them yourself across the border. Therefore, you have lots of mostly destitute women, mostly women, carrying bags for importers on their back and queuing on a daily basis to carry those goods into Spain, which are then being sold and traded onto the European market. Again, it's a story of migration. It's a story of colonialism and surveillance and policing. It's a story as well of gendering. Once again, we're looking at mainly at women carrying those goods across a given border. One of the stories of migration that we looked at. Another example, lighter, I'd say, this was part of our fifth issue called Micro Odysseys, and this is CERN, the Atomic Research Center at the border between France and Switzerland, mostly based in Switzerland. And what we found fascinating with CERN, is that we started kind of a poetic, kind of as a joke, this research, but you have protons going billions of times a day. You have protons going all around the border and crossing France and Switzerland's border on a daily basis, like millions, billions of times per second. So we wanted to go there because it's kind of a space which is fantastic, and we really wanted to look at it. So we wanted to find an excuse, and that was our excuse to go there and visit. But what we've discovered was very dynamic and complex spaces at the border between those two countries, which are really close, and I'm talking culturally, yet obviously two different political entities. This space creates diplomatic issues, creates issues in terms of labor, creates issues in terms of how do you get in the country? Do you get in by France? Do you live in France? Do you get in by Switzerland? And therefore you live in Switzerland. What happens, for instance, when you have the attacks in France and the country decides to shut down, and all of a sudden the border, the physical border, is reenacted between Switzerland and France, and therefore people have to check in every day, line up for hours and hours to get into the space. What happens for the people doing the cleaning, the janitors of the company? When they work for 4 hours in France and when they work for 4 hours in Switzerland, they have to choose which labor law applies. And that was the case until, I think, 2008, where they finally reached an agreement between Switzerland and France for the janitors of that specific space there. So we unraveled and unfolded a variety and a rich aspect of CERN, of science diplomacy, but also of collaboration between two two close countries. Another fascinating element, which is obviously really important for all of you, all of us, I mean, I'm not an architect, but I'll come back to that. All of you architects, the issue of sand, which is the main component of concrete. Sand today is the most traded commodity. This is a photo essay, this is a research done by a Singaporean photographer now, London-based, called Simplification. And she looked at the migration of sand, she looked at the trade of sand, how sand is being taken from a given country, say Vietnam, to be exported to Singapore to reclaim land, to build skyscrapers, and what it means in terms of ecological issues, what it means in terms of the social issues and the environmental issues that it leads to. Again, this is the migration of a microscopic element, but it's so important and it's detrimental to the way we look at cities and the way we look at the way buildings are done today. Quickly, also a few elements from our sixth issue and last issue. This is a piece about Esperanto, that European language which was invented in the late 19th century as a way to create an international community of exchange. And this is a piece looking at Esperanto communities in Yorkshire, in England, and how they communicated across communities around the world. A very dear topic I really love, because my granddad, which I never met, was an Esperanto speaker, so he believed in that ideal, in that utopia. Another example, this is a piece about carp, the fish. Again, that sixth issue is about migration and food and taste, and what migrates better than food. I always love to talk about this example of, in France, the favorite dish is couscous, which is of Northern African. In the UK, it's curry, which is kind of an invented dish, but I won't linger on that. I don't know that enough. And I always like to talk about this example in France when a few years ago, one of the leaders of the far-right party decided to celebrate political victory eating couscous. And it created a huge debate amongst far-right sympathizers that he was in Strasbourg on that day, and they said, you should have eaten choucroute, that's the national dish of Alsace. And then they started to argue about, but you moron, you eat tomatoes. Tomatoes are not for France, they came from somewhere else, but you eat pizza on a daily basis. Pizza is Italian. So again, it's anecdotal, but it kind of unfolds a profound issues around migration, and again, a demonstration that migration is everywhere and it's part of our lives, even if you're a far-right sympathizer. Another, and this is my last example, this is about world heritage, the notion of world heritage, which I think is something that you are all sensible to as architects. May you work on new buildings, or may you work on retrofitting and renovation. But this is a piece about the notion of world heritage and how much cultural appropriation, how much imperialism there is in the notion of world heritage. This is written by an American researcher, Andrew Scheinman, who looked especially at the issue of Palmyra in Syria and how the killing of 25 people did not shock anyone, but then the destruction of a city then created a whole international backlash on this topic. And also, it's of course a really nice way, this was in the last issue, and a really nice way to link back to Edward Said's original approach to Orientalism. Very quickly, we have the ambition of this work. We decided to go for printed, for the medium of printing, because we thought that it was the most future-proof. I hate this word, but it's really convenient. It was the ones which would allow the project to grow old in the best way. It was also the ones where we could control all the elements in a very neat way. So the font, and so we pushed everything very far. The font is bespoke, and sort of by playing with italics, by playing with different forms, uppercase, lowercase, you create arrows, you create dead ends, you create boundaries amongst the different character. We did a lot of research on the mapping, which also kind of became the mark of this publication. A lot of research, a lot of maps, and a lot of original maps. And the whole layout was really inspired by atlases. So that's why we liked to organize the different pieces by regions. And this is, by the way, because we've been challenged on this a lot, but the UN, the United Nations, has a geo-scheme which kind of lists and sort of organizes all the countries of the world into regions. So we've used that to make sure we would not offend anyone. So every time someone is offended, we say, this is the UN, so question the UN. This is the sort of final box set. As I was saying, the publication has now stopped, and this is a box set we've just released a few weeks ago, which is already sold out, so I'm not even trying to make money here. But on that box set, we wanted to sort of portray as a kind of an atypical table of contents all the pieces we've published in the different regions that we've explored. Two things that I wanted to take away. First of all, we've been we've been trapped in our own game because a lot of the pieces we've published cannot be restricted to one given region of the world. So that's why you have a lot of people here in worldwide and even outer space, because we also looked at spatial issues with stars and issues like this. It's also, for me, revealing of one of our failures, which is the fact that we've limited, you see there's a really huge issue of diversity of localizations of our contributors. This is a very small grassroots project. We started 4 people. We did a Kickstarter to print the first issue. We printed 800 copies. They sold out very quickly. And that's why we realized there was an appetite for this kind of topic. And to this date, we've sold 20,000 copies of this publication, which is kind of weird for a small publications dealt by 4 unexperienced people into that domain. But one of the learnings from this is that social networks act as boundaries in the sense that we have been, even though we did not wish so, we have been limited by the people we knew, by the disciplines and groups we were part of. And the time for us to generally grow an international network, even though we have internet, even though we have Facebook and Twitter, is actually very time-consuming, and we've realized that the project going over 3 years did not allow us. It's just allowing us now to reach out to a new audience of people with whom we have no direct or indirect links. The other learning, which is a bit harsh but true, is that we have failed. The ambition of this project was to disconnect the term of migration from its negative political discourse and reclaim it. Sadly, since 2016, the situation did not exactly improve. We've obviously went through very difficult situation in the UK, in the US, and across other parts of the world, and I'll come back to that. Most importantly, for me, the ambition of this project was to use migration as a spatial matrix, as a matrix of analysis of the world around us, and the different elements that compose it. And that proved extremely successful. We had different themes for each issue, but the whole excuse was to look at migration. And what was really interesting for us is that by looking at the world through migration, you can actually touch at all the different subjects, all the different regions, all the different aspects of all the different people around the planet. And that's really interesting because it demonstrates via experience and research and publication and writing and talking about this topic that migration is all and all is migration, in the sense that you cannot find someone on the planet, you cannot find a profession, a social group that can live disconnected from any migration phenomena. Now, to conclude, there are different elements that I wanted to touch upon, and to come back to the main issue of these presentations, which is narratives. The first thing I want to touch upon is, well, the B word, and I apologize to all the British people in the room, but I'm a French person living in London, so I've had to deal with that topic in a very traumatizing way for the last few years. And it's a very contentious issue, it's a very big issue. But the reason why I wanted to bring it in today is because I think it tells a lot about narratives and about migration. The first issue that I want to bring in is that of simplification of a complex topic. There has been promises that the Brexit could leave the European Union, And this was based on a simplistic approach to the EU and a simplistic approach to migration itself. Here, the aim was to convey a very simplistic approach, and now we are finding ourselves, and it's actually quite an interesting element to do, but trying to disconnect all the different elements, and then people start to realize how much the UK is connected to the world, obviously, but connected to the EU in a very intricate way, and to decompose, dissect all these different links and relationships is almost impossible, and once again, Brexit has been postponed, though I'm sure it will happen again. So simplification is a key issue here. Simplification, especially in relation to migration, leads to hatred, because hate is a very easy message to sell. On the 16th of June 2016, so a few days before Brexit, a member of parliament, Labour, was murdered by a far-right sympathizer. She was shot twice in the head, once in the chest, and stabbed 15 times by a far-right sympathizer who saw in her an agent of liberal, open to migration and a threat to the white people. That's something he said in his trial, and he was obviously convicted. The climate in the UK at the moment is extremely disturbing. It's it's full of anxiety. We have to bear in mind the UK until very recently was that liberal, open-minded, open to migration country that a lot of us European looked at to. A lot of Latvians live in the UK because they left there to have other opportunities and to construct a new life. So it's really anxious. It's full of anxiety that I look at the UK, and I live in the UK, and I see how this country cracked down and sort of completely switched sides to be on the further right of Europe today. We have a prime minister who talks of surrendering to the EU, tapping into that imaginary of World War II, and basically comparing the EU to Nazi Germany and all the MPs against him as collaborators, right? This is the UK on a daily basis. The country, all of a sudden in 3 years, completely collapsed into a dark hole when it comes to narratives and when it comes to politics. So I think it says a lot about the instability of what we thought is secure, what we think is safe. And you have to go through that kind of thing now. This is my visa for the UK, which I've had to apply for as a European citizen because I wanted to be safe in this country. So I've had to go for my visa and get my settled status. The reason why I look like this on that picture is because I had to take this picture in an English pub, one of the oldest pub in London. I had met with a Romanian friend of mine so that I could get her Android phone, her made in China Android phone, because the app to apply for the visa was only Android, and I had an iPhone at the time. So we met in that pub, we took that picture, I applied for my visa, and because I've been here for a long time in a very simple status, it was very easy and straightforward. In the room next door, you had a group of lads playing Irish tunes on an ancient instrument, and this, for me, is the whole kind of weird situation that the UK goes through at the moment. And the reason why I wanted to touch, upon the UK is for all these elements. Simplification of a discourse on migration, a simplistic approach to trade, a simplistic approach to relationship to the other, and a question of narratives. And I think that's key for us as urbanists, that's key for us as architects, key for us as well as politicians, as developers, as clients, and of course as citizens. The fact that migration can barely be controlled, that migration cannot be stopped, and that migration is part of a way of lives, the way of societies are built, and it's not about challenging that will make the progress, that will make the issue or that theme mature and go in a more interesting direction. It's more about how do we challenge and question those narratives that we associate to migration, and look at the richness of that theme, the richness of that concept on a daily basis. Thank you very much.